The champagne flutes were still raised when my mother said it. Marcus has always been our rock. Everything we have, everything, is because of him. 43 faces turned toward my brother. Applause. Someone whistled. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat by the kitchen, the one with the wobbly leg. And I smiled into my wine glass. My father didn't look at me once. He should have, because the one number I'd written on a napkin and slid toward the family attorney 20 minutes earlier, it was about to make everything in that room belong to me. If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments, and I will give you a heart. I was 7 years old the first time I understood what I was in that family. Not a daughter, not even a backup plan. I was furniture, present enough to fill a space, invisible enough to never be considered. My mother had baked a cake that Saturday. 3 layers, cream cheese frosting, the kind she only made for special occasions. I came downstairs in my school uniform because I'd forgotten it was the weekend, and I saw the candles, and for exactly 4 seconds, I let myself believe it was for me. My birthday had passed 3 weeks earlier with a grocery store cupcake and a card my father signed without reading. But the cake had roses on it. Pink ones. My favorite. I reached out and touched the edge of the plate, and my mother slapped my hand so fast I didn't even process the sting before the sound came. "Don't you dare," she said. "That's for Marcus. He passed his spelling bee." Marcus was 9. He'd come in second place. But second place, when you're the golden child, gets roses. When I came in first at my school science fair that same year, my father nodded from behind his newspaper and said, "Don't let it go to your head." I remember folding my ribbon and putting it at the bottom of my sock drawer because looking at it hurt more than never having won it. That was the architecture of my childhood, built specifically so I could never stand too tall inside it. I learned to make myself small, not out of weakness, out of strategy. Because even at 7, some part of me was already watching, already filing things away, already understanding that the people who underestimate you hand you their blueprints without realizing it. By the time I was in high school, I had stopped expecting fairness and started expecting information. I watched how money moved in our house. I watched whose name appeared on which documents. I watched my father take calls in the hallway and lower his voice when he talked about the property downtown, the one he'd inherited from his own father, the one nobody ever discussed at the dinner table. I was 17 when I overheard him tell my uncle that he planned to put everything in Marcus's name, eventually, to keep it simple. I remember standing in the hallway in socked feet, not breathing, doing arithmetic in my head that no teenager should have to do. I didn't cry. I went back to my room, opened my notebook, and wrote down everything I'd heard, word for word, with the date and time in the margin. I don't know why I did it. Instinct, maybe. Or maybe I already knew, somewhere deep and quiet, that documentation was going to be the only language this family ever respected. College was when the gap became a canyon. Marcus got a full financial package from my parents, tuition, housing, a monthly allowance that was more than some people's salaries. I received a conversation. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she didn't offer me and explained, with genuine calm, that they'd already stretched themselves for Marcus and that I was resourceful and would figure it out. Resourceful, as though that were a compliment and not a quiet instruction to disappear gracefully. I figured it out. I worked 3 jobs in my first year. I cleaned offices on Thursday nights. I tutored underclassmen in economics on weekends. I ate a lot of instant noodles, and I did not call home to complain because complaining would have required them to care, and I already knew the cost of needing something from people who had decided you didn't qualify for receiving it. I graduated with honors. Nobody came. Marcus dropped out in his second year. Too much pressure. My mother explained to relatives, too sensitive for that environment, and they threw him a dinner to celebrate his brave decision to pivot. A dinner with a tablecloth and real silverware. I sat in my cap and gown alone in my apartment that evening eating takeout, and I laughed. Not bitterly, genuinely, because something had crystallized for me in that moment. I was never going to win in their system. So I had spent 4 years quietly building my own. What they didn't know, what nobody in that family had thought to ask, was what I had studied. They assumed I'd done something soft, something forgettable. A general degree, business maybe, or communications. Something that would make me competent enough to be dismissed and unremarkable enough to be forgotten. I had studied finance. Then I'd sat for my CPA exam. Then, while working my first real job at an accounting firm downtown, I had quietly enrolled in night classes for estate and property law. Not because I planned to become a lawyer, because I planned to understand every single legal structure my father had ever built around that family's assets, and I wanted to understand it better than he did, better than his attorney did, better than Marcus ever would, even if someone handed him the documents and read them out loud. By the time I was 26, I knew things about my family's financial structure that my own father did not know. Not because I had stolen anything, not because I had done anything wrong, because I had simply paid attention while everyone else was busy deciding I wasn't worth paying attention to. The property downtown, the one my father had inherited, the one he muttered about in hallways, had a legal complication buried in the original deed. A clause, old language, the kind that predates modern property law in our state, the kind that a general practice attorney might overlook because it required cross-referencing 3 separate statutes that had been amended in 1987. I found it on a Tuesday evening in my apartment with a glass of water and a highlighter. I read it 4 times. Then I pulled out my old notebook, the one I'd started at 17, and I wrote it down with the statute numbers in the margin. Then I made a phone call to a property law specialist I'd met at a conference the previous spring, a woman named Diane who owed me a favor for work I'd done untangling a client's estate mess. I didn't tell Diane everything. I asked her a hypothetical. She gave me a 30-minute answer that confirmed what I already suspected. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in my quiet apartment for a long time. The clause meant that the property, the crown jewel of everything my father had built his legacy around, the thing he intended to hand to Marcus like a birthright wrapped in ribbon, could not be legally transferred without the consent of all living direct descendants of the original inheritor. My grandfather had 2 children, my father and my Aunt Renata, who had left the country in her 30s after a falling out nobody ever fully explained, and who my father had not spoken to in over 20 years. Renata, who had no idea what her silence was worth. Renata, who I had found 18 months earlier through a combination of public records, a genealogy database, and one very careful email that I had rewritten 11 times before sending. Now, let me ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from right now? Drop your city in the comments, because the fact that you're still here tells me you already know this story is about to go somewhere they never saw coming. Because here's what nobody at that anniversary dinner understood when they raised their glasses to my brother and called him the foundation of everything. I had already spent 3 years making sure that foundation had my name carved into the bottom of it. What I haven't told you yet is what was on the napkin I passed to the attorney. And why. When he read it, he excused himself from the table for 11 minutes and came back without his drink. The attorney's name was Gerald Fitch. He had worked for my father for 19 years, handled every property transaction, every LLC formation, every trust amendment, every handshake deal that needed paper behind it. And in all that time, my father had never once introduced him to me by name. I was the daughter when Gerald came to the house. Sometimes I was Marcus's sister. Once, at a holiday gathering when I was maybe 22, my father gestured in my general direction while talking to Gerald and said, and that one's in school somewhere," without breaking his conversational stride. Gerald had smiled politely and turned back to my father, and I had stood there holding a glass of sparkling cider, feeling the particular coldness of being narrated in third person while standing in the room. I filed that moment too. Not in my notebook this time. In the part of me that doesn't forget the texture of being erased. What my father never considered, because why would he? I was furniture, I was background, was that Gerald Fitch was a man who took his professional obligations seriously. Seriously enough that when a licensed CPA and estate law practitioner contacted his office 14 months before that anniversary dinner, introducing herself professionally, referencing specific statute numbers, and a deed clause that had significant implications for an active estate structure he was currently administering, Gerald did not dismiss the inquiry. He took the meeting. I wore a charcoal blazer and flat shoes, and I brought a folder with 12 tab sections, and I sat across from Gerald Fitch in his downtown office, and I watched his face move through 4 distinct emotional phases in the span of about 40 minutes. The first phase was professional courtesy, the careful neutrality of a man who has learned not to react until he understands what he's dealing with. The second phase was recognition, the slow dawning that the clause I was referencing was real, that he had in fact reviewed that deed, that something had been missed. The third phase was the one I had prepared for, the conflict. I could see it move across his face like weather. He was my father's attorney. He had a duty, but he also had a duty to the integrity of the estate structure itself. And what I was presenting to him was a legal landmine sitting directly beneath the transaction my father was planning to execute within the next 18 months. Gerald leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment. "You understand what you're bringing to me," he said. It wasn't a question. "I understand exactly what I'm bringing to you," I said. "I want to make sure you do too." I slid the last tab across the desk. It contained a single page, a letter from Renata. Not a threatening letter, not a legal demand, just a letter, handwritten, in which my aunt confirmed that she was aware of her rights as a co-inheriting descendant under the original deed terms, that she had obtained independent legal counsel in her country of residence, and that she wished to be kept informed of any planned transfers or encumbrances relating to the property in question. Renata had not asked for money. She had not made threats. She had simply, quietly, and irrevocably made herself visible. Gerald read the letter twice. Then he set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and he looked at me across the desk with an expression I had never seen an adult direct at me before. Respect. Clean, uncomplicated, professional respect. "How long have you been building this?" he asked. "Since I was 17, I said. I just didn't know exactly what I was building yet." He nodded slowly. Then he said something that told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties actually lived. "Your father is planning to execute the transfer at the end of the fiscal year," he said. "He's already instructed me to begin drafting the documentation." He wasn't betraying my father. He was telling me, as a legal professional speaking to another legal professional, that the clock was running and that I needed to understand the timeline. I thanked him. I closed my folder. I shook his hand, and I told him that I wasn't there to create a crisis. I was there to ensure that when the transfer was attempted, the correct parties were properly notified as required by law. Nothing more. Nothing less. What I did not tell Gerald, what I have not told anyone until right now, was that Renata and I had been exchanging emails for over a year by that point, and that our correspondence had moved well beyond the introductory stage into something that felt, surprisingly and quietly, like family. She was sharp. Funny even. She had my grandmother's eyes in the one photograph she'd sent, and a way of writing that was direct without being cold. She told me about the falling out with my father, not all of it, not yet, but enough for me to understand that her absence from our lives had not been entirely her choice. She told me she had a daughter my age, She told me that when she had left, she had signed away certain things under pressure that she had never entirely made peace with. And she told me that when I had first reached out with my careful, rewritten 11 times email, she had read it 3 times and then called her attorney before she called anyone else, because something in the way I had phrased it told her that I was someone who understood that careful mattered more than fast. We were alike, Renata and I, in ways that made sense only if you understood what it felt like to be pushed to the edge of a family structure and forced to develop your own architecture for surviving outside it. I had been building something with her, not a weapon, not yet, but the kind of quiet infrastructure that only becomes visible when someone tries to move something large through a space they assumed was empty. While all of this was developing, my brother Marcus had been doing what Marcus always did, performing. He had launched a business with my father's backing, a consulting firm with a polished website and a logo that cost more than my first semester's tuition. The firm had clients, 3 of them all connected to my father's network, all relationships that existed because my father had made phone calls on Marcus's behalf. On paper, it looked like momentum. It looked like the golden child ascending on merit. What it actually was, as I knew from the financial statements Marcus had carelessly left open on a shared family cloud drive he'd added me to years ago and forgotten about. Yes, that cloud drive, the one he'd never once considered I might actually look at, was a company that had burned through its initial capital in 14 months, had 1 client remaining, had outstanding invoices it couldn't collect on, and had quietly taken a short-term loan using a piece of property as collateral. The property was one of 4 assets sitting inside a family LLC, an LLC in which, due to a formation document that Gerald had drafted 8 years ago, and that contained a standard inclusion clause for direct family members, I was technically still a listed member. Not a managing member, not a decision maker, but a member. With standing, my father had never removed me because it had never occurred to him that I would ever look. He had structured things the way powerful men structure things when they believe the women in their lives are decorative, efficiently for himself, invisibly for everyone else. He had handed me a seat at the table without ever realizing he'd done it, because he had never once believed I would show up and sit down. Now here is where it gets complicated, and I need you to stay with me because this next part is the piece that changes the shape of everything that came before it. 3 weeks before the anniversary dinner, Marcus called me. Not to catch up. Marcus didn't do that. He called because he needed something, which was the only reason he ever made contact. His voice had the particular texture of someone performing casual while drowning. "Hey, so Dad's doing this dinner thing," he said. "Anniversary. Big venue. The whole family. You know how he gets. He wants it to look good." "I know about the dinner," I said. Right. So are you coming?" "I'm coming," I said. There was a pause. Then he said, "Cool. Hey, just so you know, Dad's probably going to make some announcements about the business, about some plans going forward. Just don't you know. Don't make it weird. Don't make it weird." I held the phone for a moment and looked out my apartment window at the city I had built my life in without a single dollar of family money, and I thought about all the years of grocery store cupcakes and sock drawer ribbons and sparkling cider and third-person erasure, and I said, very pleasantly, "Of course not, Marcus. I'll be on my best behavior." I hung up and opened my email and sent Diane a message with 3 words. "It's time. Ready." What I hadn't told Marcus, what nobody in that family had any idea about, was that the dinner was going to be the last place any of them would have the luxury of underestimating me. Because what I had in my bag that evening wasn't just information. It was the kind of structural leverage that, once activated, cannot be undone. And the attorney sitting 3 seats down from my father was about to find out exactly how long I had been waiting for the right moment to use it. The venue my father chose for the anniversary dinner was called the Meridian. It was the kind of place that had a maitre d' who remembered your name, and a wine list that came in a leather binder and tablecloths so white, and so pressed they looked like they had never been touched by anything ordinary. My father loved it there because it made him feel like the version of himself he had spent his whole life performing. The patriarch, the provider, the man of consequence who walked into rooms and made them rearrange themselves around him. He had reserved the private dining room. 43 guests. A long rectangular table with candles down the center and name cards in little gold holders, and a custom menu printed on heavy cardstock with my parents' names embossed at the top in script. I know this because I had seen the planning documents. Not because anyone invited me into the planning process. I was informed of the date, given an address, and told what time to arrive, the same way you'd send information to a vendor. The planning documents existed in the shared family cloud drive that Marcus had forgotten about, alongside a folder labeled Dad Anniversary that contained the seating chart, the menu, the guest list, the venue contract, and a draft of the speech my father intended to give. I read the speech 3 days before the dinner. I read it the way you read something that confirms what you already knew, but still lands like a physical thing in the center of your chest. It was 4 pages. Marcus's name appeared 19 times. My name appeared once, in a sentence that read, and of course our daughter who has made her own way, which is the kind of sentence that sounds like acknowledgement until you read it next to 19 mentions of someone else and understand that it is actually a dismissal dressed in punctuation. I printed the speech. I put it in the tabbed folder I was bringing to the dinner. Not to confront anyone with it, just to have it, just to hold the paper proof of the architecture of my erasure in my hands, so that when the moment came, I would be operating from fact and not from feeling. The dress I wore that evening was midnight blue, not because I was trying to make a statement about mourning or power or any of the things people retroactively assign meaning to. I wore it because it was the most expensive thing I owned. I had bought it with my own money, and it fit like it was designed specifically for the version of me that had spent 15 years preparing for a room like this one. I arrived 7 minutes early, not early enough to seem eager, early enough to watch everyone else walk in. I stood near the entrance with a glass of water, not wine, water, because I needed every single one of my faculties available and unblurred, and I watched my family fill the room. My aunts in their dressed up best. My cousins photographing everything for social media before the food arrived. My mother moving through the space with the particular energy of a woman who had organized something impressive and needed everyone to register that fact. And Marcus arrived 12 minutes after me with his girlfriend and a confidence that occupied space the way only borrowed confidence does, wide and loud and slightly too much, like someone turned a dial 2 notches past where it should sit. He was wearing a suit I recognized from his Instagram, the one he posted in front of a rented sports car with a caption about momentum and manifestation. He walked in and the room shifted toward him the way rooms always shifted toward Marcus, and I watched my mother's face open like a window when she saw him, and I took a sip of water and stayed exactly where I was. My father arrived last. He always arrived last because arriving last meant everyone was already present to witness the entrance. He was in a dark suit with a pocket square that matched my mother's dress, coordinated, deliberate, the visual language of a couple who wanted their unity to read as power. He shook hands across the room. He laughed at things before the punchline. He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and left it there for a long moment like he was charging something. He did not look for me when he entered the room. I found my seat, the one by the kitchen, the wobbly one. I had seen it on the seating chart, and I had not asked to be moved because I did not need a better seat to do what I came to do. I sat down. I put my bag under my chair. I unfolded my napkin. Gerald Fitch arrived with his wife at 6:48 and sat 4 seats to my father's left. He saw me when he sat down. Our eyes met for exactly 2 seconds, and then we both looked away. The practiced non-acknowledgement of two people who have an agreement and understand the value of not advertising it. The dinner began the way these dinners always begin. Appetizers, wine, the warm hum of people who see each other twice a year pretending the gap doesn't exist. I talked to my cousin Priya about her renovation project. I asked my uncle about his knee surgery. I was pleasant and present and entirely unremarkable, which was exactly the point, because the most dangerous thing I could have been in that room that evening was memorable too soon. Around the time the main course arrived, my father stood up and tapped his glass. The room settled. He smiled the smile of a man who had rehearsed this moment and was pleased with what he'd rehearsed, and he began to speak. He talked about legacy. He talked about what it means to build something from nothing and watch it grow. He talked about family as the foundation of everything real. He mentioned his own father, the property, the sacrifice, the inheritance of responsibility that gets passed from hand to hand through generations of men who understand what it means to carry something forward. He said the word men 3 times in 4 sentences, and nobody in that room flinched except me, and I noticed Gerald's wife, who pressed her lips together almost imperceptibly and reached for her wine. Then he turned to Marcus, and the speech became a different kind of thing entirely. He talked about Marcus's vision, Marcus's courage, the consulting firm, which he described as a thriving enterprise that was reshaping how businesses in this city approached growth, which was a creative interpretation of a company with one remaining client and an outstanding loan, was, according to my father's speech, proof of the golden child's destiny made manifest. He announced, to the applause of 43 people who did not have access to the financial statements I had read, that he would be formally transferring management of the downtown property to Marcus at the end of the fiscal year as a mark of his confidence in his son's leadership. And then he said, everything I have built will continue in capable hands. And he raised his glass, and the room raised their glasses, and Marcus looked at his shoes for exactly 2 seconds in the particular way people look at their shoes when they are trying to seem humble while feeling triumphant. And I sat at the wobbly table by the kitchen, and I did not raise my glass. I reached into my bag instead. I had written one thing on the napkin. Not a threat, not a demand, just a number. A statute number. Specifically, it was the number of the amended property code section that governed the consent requirements for transfer of inherited real property, where multiple descendant claims existed. 11 digits. I folded the napkin once. I caught Gerald's eye, and I slid it down the table to him. He didn't open it immediately. He set it beside his plate and finished the bite he was taking, and then, with the unhurried precision of a man who has learned not to react until he is ready, he unfolded it. I watched him read it. I watched the color do something complicated in his face. He refolded the napkin very carefully, placed it back beside his plate, excused himself from the table, and walked out of the private dining room. He was gone for 11 minutes. I know because I timed it. In those 11 minutes, my father continued his toast. My mother cried beautifully on cue. Marcus accepted congratulations from relatives who were already mentally calculating what his elevation meant for their proximity to the family's resources. And I ate my salmon and thought about Renata. Renata, who was currently awake in a time zone 6 hours ahead, who had, at my request, sent a formal letter that morning from her attorney's office to Gerald Fitch's professional address, delivered digitally with a red receipt, referencing the statute number, confirming her standing as a co-claimant descendant, and formally requesting that any planned property transfers be suspended pending a legal review of the deed's consent requirements. The letter had been delivered at 9:14 that morning. Gerald had received it. I knew this because Renata's attorney had confirmed the read receipt, which meant that when Gerald sat back down at that table and picked up his wine glass, he was a man who had spent 11 minutes in a hallway doing arithmetic that had no good answer for the person who had trusted him with 19 years of their estate planning. Now, if you've been watching this from the beginning and you're still here, first of all, you already know this isn't a story about revenge the way people usually mean it, messy and hot and regrettable. This is something more precise than that, And I think that's why you're still watching. If this story is hitting different for you, if you recognize any piece of what it feels like to be the one they counted out, go ahead and subscribe right now, because what happens when my father finishes his toast and Gerald comes back to that table is the part that changes the whole shape of everything I've described so far, and I need you present for it. Gerald sat back down at 6 minutes past the end of my father's speech. My father was still receiving congratulations, still moving through the room on the current of other people's admiration, still the man of consequence the room had arranged itself around. Marcus was beside him, the heir apparent, the golden child with his borrowed confidence and his performing posture and his one remaining client. And I was still at the wobbly table by the kitchen, finishing my salmon, when Gerald leaned across 2 seats and said something quietly to his wife, who then picked up her purse, which is what women do when they are being told they may need to leave sooner than expected. Gerald then turned and looked directly at me for the first time all evening. Not the 2-second non-acknowledgement from earlier, but a full, deliberate, held look that said he understood the situation completely and was now making a decision about which side of it he intended to stand on. I held his gaze. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I just held it the way you hold something that matters. Then Gerald did something I had not fully anticipated. Something that shifted the timeline of the evening by approximately 45 minutes and escalated everything in a direction that even I, who had spent 3 years preparing for this room, had not precisely mapped. He stood up. He walked to my father, and he said, quietly enough that only the 4 people nearest heard it, "Richard, we need to speak privately before the evening goes any further. There's a legal matter that requires your immediate attention." My father's face did what faces do when confidence meets something it wasn't expecting. It held its shape for just a second too long before adjusting. He laughed, the social laugh, the placeholder laugh. "Gerald, whatever it is, it can wait for tonight. We're celebrating. It cannot wait," Gerald said, and he said it with the particular flatness of a man who has made a decision and is no longer available for negotiation on the point. My father looked around the room. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the guests still holding their glasses. He looked everywhere except at me. And that was the first mistake of the evening. Because if he had looked at me, if he had ever in 34 years actually looked at me the way you look at someone you consider a full person, he might have seen something in my face that would have told him what was already in motion. He didn't look. He followed Gerald out of the room. And Marcus, still flushed with the warmth of the toast, still basking, leaned over to one of our cousins and said something that made them both laugh. And the party continued around the empty space where my father had been, and nobody, not one person in that room, thought to wonder what I had slid across the table on a folded napkin. What my father didn't know yet, what he was about to discover in a hallway conversation with his own attorney, was that the transfer he had announced to 43 people tonight was not legally executable in its current form, and that the reason it wasn't executable had a name. And that name had been in contact with me for 14 months, and that I had known about the Renata complication for 3 years before I walked into Gerald's office. But here's the piece I haven't told you yet, the piece that makes everything I just described feel like the surface layer of something much deeper. The LLC, the one Marcus had unknowingly used as collateral for his business loan, the one with the formation document that listed me as a member. I had not been passive in that structure. 3 months before the dinner, using my standing as a listed LLC member, I had formally requested access to the entity's financial records, a right guaranteed to me under the operating agreement. The request had been sent through a business attorney, properly documented, legally unimpeachable. The records I received in response contained something that Gerald did not know about. Something that Marcus definitely did not know I knew about. Something that, when combined with the Renata letter and the statute number on the napkin, created a picture so complete and so damaging that my father was not just looking at a delayed property transfer. He was looking at something that could unravel every financial structure he had spent 30 years constructing. And he was about to find that out in a hallway while his guests finished their salmon and his golden child laughed at a cousin's joke 40 feet away. The hallway outside the Meridian's private dining room was narrow and carpeted in deep burgundy. The kind of carpet that absorbs sound and makes everything that happens on it feel more confidential than it actually is. There were 2 sconces on the wall that gave off a warm amber light and a small console table with a flower arrangement that someone had paid too much for. I know what that hallway looked like because I had walked it twice before the dinner started. Once when I arrived, once when I went to the restroom at 6:30 and I had noted the sight lines, noted where the dining room door sat relative to the corridor bend, noted that a conversation held at the midpoint of that hallway would be clearly visible through the small rectangular window set into the dining room door, but not audible to anyone inside. I note things. I always have. It is the habit of someone who learned early that information is the only currency that cannot be taken from you. My father and Gerald stood in that hallway for 22 minutes. I know the duration because I kept my phone face down on the table, counted the elapsed time in my head, and cross-referenced it when my father walked back in. 22 minutes is a long time to stand in a carpeted hallway with a flower arrangement while your anniversary party continues without you. It is long enough for a man to move through denial and into something colder and more calculating. I watched the dining room door the entire time they were gone. Not obviously. I was talking to my Aunt Celia about her garden, asking questions about soil drainage with what I can only describe as Oscar-worthy attentiveness. But my peripheral vision was entirely committed to that rectangular window in the door. I saw Gerald's silhouette gesturing at the 7-minute mark. I saw my father's silhouette go very still at the 11-minute mark. At the 17-minute mark, I saw my father put one hand against the wall, the flat-palmed steadying gesture of a man whose legs have briefly considered failing him. And at 22 minutes, my father opened the door and walked back into the room. He had rearranged his face. I will give him that. He was good at it, the smooth social recovery, the practiced return to warmth, and if you were not specifically watching for the seams, you would not have seen them. But I was watching for the seams. His jaw was set 2 millimeters tighter than it had been before. His pocket square was slightly displaced. The way pocket squares get when a man has run his hand across his chest in the unconscious self-soothing gesture of someone managing a shock response. His eyes, when he re-entered the room, went immediately to Marcus. Not to my mother, not to the guests, to Marcus. And the look that passed between them lasted less than a second, but it contained something I recognized. The look of a man who has just learned that a structure he believed was solid has developed a crack, and who is now calculating how to manage that information without letting anyone else see the damage. Marcus read his father's face the way you read a face you've been trained your entire life to monitor for approval, and something shifted in his posture. Fractional, barely visible, but I saw it because I had spent 34 years reading the same room they had spent 34 years performing in, and I knew every register of that family's emotional weather system better than they knew it themselves. My father sat back down. He picked up his wine glass. He smiled at something my uncle said. He was managing. He was very good at managing. What he did not know yet, what Gerald had not fully disclosed in the hallway, because Gerald himself had only just begun to understand the full scope of what he was dealing with, was the LLC documentation. Gerald knew about Renata. Gerald knew about the statute. Gerald knew the property transfer was compromised. What Gerald did not yet know was what I had found inside the financial records the LLC had been legally required to provide me. Let me tell you exactly what was in those records, because this is the part that changes the shape of everything. And I promised you I would show you the how without leaving out a single detail. When Marcus took the short-term business loan 3 months before the anniversary dinner, he had used a parcel of LLC-owned property as collateral. This was, on its face, a significant problem given my membership standing in the LLC and the fact that no member vote had been called before the collateral was pledged, a direct violation of the operating agreement's unanimous consent clause for asset encumbrance. But that was the surface problem. The document buried inside the financial records, the one on page 47 of a 63-page package that an attorney who was not specifically looking for it might have skimmed past, was a personal guarantee. Marcus, in order to secure the loan at the rate he needed, had signed a personal guarantee that extended his liability beyond the LLC structure. Personal guarantees do this. They reach through the corporate veil that an LLC is designed to provide and make the individual personally responsible for the debt if the entity cannot satisfy it. This is standard practice. What was not standard was what Marcus had listed as his personal assets to support the guarantee. He had listed, among other things, his anticipated inheritance share of the downtown property, the property that was currently encumbered by Renata's claim. The property that could not be legally transferred without consent that did not yet exist, which meant that the collateral supporting the loan was the LLC parcel. The guarantee backing the loan was a property Marcus did not yet legally control and might never control. And the loan itself was coming due in 4 months. For months, I had sat in my apartment with those 63 pages and a yellow legal pad, and I had done the arithmetic 3 times to make sure I had it right. The number said the same thing every time. Marcus's business was not just struggling. It was structurally insolvent in a way that, when the loan came due and the lender examined the guarantee and discovered the property encumbrance, was going to create a cascade. The lender would call the guarantee. The guarantee would fail because the anticipated inheritance asset was compromised. The lender would then pursue the LLC parcel as the original collateral, which would trigger a dispute within the LLC because the asset had been pledged without member consent, which would draw me, as a listed member with standing, directly into the legal proceedings, which would surface everything: the clause, the statute, Renata, the unauthorized encumbrance, all of it, in a formal legal context from which there would be no graceful exit for anyone on my father's side of the table. I had not created this situation. Marcus had created it himself, with his borrowed confidence and his performed momentum and his father's phone calls and a loan he could not service. And he had done it with such thorough carelessness that the documentation was immaculate. There was nothing ambiguous. Nothing I had to construct or manipulate. I had simply gone to the place where the truth was kept and I had read it. Now, let me tell you about the envelope. 3 weeks before the dinner, after I had completed my review of the LLC financials and had my final call with Diane and had confirmed with Renata's attorney that the formal letter was prepared and ready to send on my signal, I assembled a packet. Not the 12-tab folder I had brought to Gerald's office 14 months earlier. Something different. Something more current, more complete, and more specifically targeted. The packet contained 4 things. First, a 2-page summary of the LLC operating agreement violations, citing specific clause numbers with the relevant pages tabbed and annotated. Second, a copy of Marcus's personal guarantee with the anticipated inheritance asset highlighted in yellow, and a 1-paragraph legal note from Diane explaining the exposure created by the Renata claim. Third, a timeline, clean, chronological, 1-page, showing the sequence of events from my grandfather's original deed, through my father's inheritance, through the LLC formation, through Marcus's loan, through Renata's letter, with every date sourced and documented. Fourth, and this is the piece that made Diane go very quiet when I told her I was including it, evaluation. An independent property valuation I had commissioned 8 months earlier from a certified appraiser, using my authority as an LLC member to request an assessment of the entity's assets. The valuation put the downtown property at a number that was significantly higher than the figure my father had been using in his internal planning documents, the planning documents I had read in the family cloud drive that Marcus had added me to and forgotten about. The gap between my father's internal figure and the independent valuation was not small. It was the kind of gap that, in certain legal and financial contexts, raises questions about whether asset values have been deliberately misrepresented. I am not saying my father had done that intentionally. I am saying the numbers existed and the gap existed, and in a formal proceeding, other people would be asking those questions, and my father would need answers that I was not certain he had. I had sealed the packet in a plain envelope. I had written Gerald Fitch's name on the outside. I had given it to the maitre d' when I arrived and asked him to deliver it to Mr. Fitch at the table at 7:15 precisely, which was based on my reading of the speech draft and my calculation of my father's rhythm, approximately 5 minutes after the formal toast concluded and the announcement about Marcus was made. The maitre d' had delivered it at 7:17. I know because I watched him cross the room. Gerald had received it, placed it beside his bread plate, and said nothing for approximately 90 seconds. Then he had opened it under the table edge. The way professionals open things in social settings when they need to read without being observed, and he had spent 4 minutes reading it while the room applauded around him. The napkin with the statute number had simply confirmed what the envelope had already established. It was my signal to him that I was present, informed, and ready. The napkin was the period at the end of a sentence I had been writing for 3 years. When my father came back from the hallway and sat down and picked up his wine glass and smiled at my uncle's joke, he did not yet know about the packet. Gerald had disclosed the Renata issue and the statute problem in the hallway. He had not yet disclosed the LLC violations or the valuation gap because he was, as I understood and had anticipated, processing the information in the sequence a careful attorney processes unexpected complexity, establishing the most urgent structural problem first and working inward. But Gerald now had everything. All 4 sections, all the tabs, all the dates. And he was sitting 4 seats to my father's left, finishing his dinner, making conversation with his wife, and doing what careful attorneys do when they have received information that changes their professional obligations. He was deciding, not whether to act. Gerald's professional obligations gave him limited discretion on that point once the information was formally in his possession. He was deciding how, and when, and in what order. I had known this would be his process because I had spent 14 months understanding Gerald Fitch's professional character well enough to predict it. I had known he would not detonate anything publicly. He would not make a scene. He would not hand my father a crisis in front of 43 guests if there was any path to handling it with more control. What Gerald had not fully accounted for, the one variable I had introduced that disrupted his preference for careful sequencing, was Marcus. Because at 8:43, while Gerald was still calibrating his approach and my father was still managing his face and the dessert was being served, Marcus stood up. He picked up his glass. He looked around the room with the expression of a man who has been told his whole life that rooms belong to him. And he said, "I just want to add something while everyone's here." My father looked up. Something moved across his face. A flicker of the tighter jaw. A half-second of the steadied hand impulse. But Marcus was already talking. Dad talked about legacy tonight. About what gets passed down and what gets built. And I want to say in front of everyone here that I am ready. The property, the business, everything we've been building. I am ready to take it forward. This is our family's moment. 43 people applauded. My mother pressed her hand to her heart. 2 cousins cheered. Gerald Fitch set down his fork very carefully and did not applaud. And I sat at the wobbly table by the kitchen and I looked at Marcus standing in the warm light of that room, in his Instagram suit, with his borrowed confidence and his performed certainty and his completely sincere belief that the ground beneath him was solid, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not triumph, something quieter than that. Something that felt almost like grief, for the version of this family that had never existed, for the roses on a cake that should sometimes have been for me, for every sock drawer ribbon and grocery store cupcake, and that one's in school somewhere. I felt it for exactly 4 seconds. Then I reached into my bag. I took out my phone. I opened an email draft I had composed 3 days earlier and had been holding unsent. It was addressed to 3 people simultaneously: Gerald Fitch, Renata's attorney, and a property law mediator I had retained 2 weeks prior whose specific expertise was multi-party inherited asset disputes. The subject line was 7 words: formal notice of member objection, transfer suspension. I pressed send. I put my phone face down on the table. I picked up my dessert fork. And while Marcus was still standing, still basking, still raising his glass to a room full of people who believed, he was the foundation of everything. The email arrived in Gerald Fitch's pocket. I watched him feel his phone vibrate. I watched him reach for it under the table edge. I watched him read the subject line. And I watched the moment, quiet, invisible to everyone else in that room, devastating in its precision, when Gerald Fitch understood that the evening was no longer manageable, that what had been a legal complication requiring careful handling had just become a formal proceeding requiring immediate disclosure, and that he was now obligated by professional duty to inform his client before the night ended that the announcement made an hour ago in front of 43 witnesses could not stand. Marcus was still talking when Gerald stood up. He crossed the room with the measured pace of a man carrying something heavy and stopped at my father's chair and leaned down and said 4 words. I could not hear them from where I sat, but I watched my father's face receive them. And I watched the wine glass in my father's hand tilt, just slightly, just a degree or 2. The involuntary physics of a grip that has suddenly lost confidence in itself. And across the table, Marcus, mid-sentence, mid-toast, finally looked at his father's face. And for the first time in the evening, and perhaps the first time in years, he did not find what he was looking for there. What he found instead was something that looked very much like the beginning of an ending. And he didn't yet know that I was the one who had written it. Marcus stopped talking mid-sentence. Not dramatically. There was no dropped glass, no gas from the room, no cinematic crash of realization. It was quieter than that and somehow worse because of it. He stopped the way an engine stops when the fuel runs out, not with a bang, but with a sputter and then a silence that takes a moment for everyone around it to register. He looked at my father. My father looked at Gerald. Gerald was looking at the middle distance with the expression of a man who has professionally committed to a course of action and is now executing it regardless of the social cost. My cousin nearest to Marcus laughed uncertainly, the reflex laugh of someone who assumes they've missed a punchline. Nobody else made a sound. My mother set down her champagne flute. It made a small clean click against the table that in the sudden quiet of that room sounded like something being locked. My father stood up slowly. He had the posture of a man trying very hard to perform composure for an audience he could feel shifting, and he said, "Gerald and I need to step out briefly. Please, everyone, enjoy dessert. We'll be right back." His voice landed almost right. Almost. There was a half beat of hesitation before briefly that anyone fluent in the language of this family would have recognized as the sound of improvisation covering a fracture. I was fluent in that language. I had been studying it since I was 7 years old. Marcus, to his credit, recovered his social footing faster than I expected. He sat down. He made a comment to his girlfriend. He picked up his fork. He was performing fine, performing unbothered, and he was doing it with a skill that told me my father had spent years teaching him how to hold a room's perception of you even when the ground had shifted, which was, I reflected, the one genuinely useful thing Marcus had learned from our father that I had also learned entirely without being taught. Gerald followed my father out of the room. The door closed, and the dinner continued. This is the part that people always find surprising when I describe it. That life just continued. That 41 remaining people ate their dessert and refilled their glasses, and the room held its warmth and its candlelight and its ambient noise of silverware and conversation. While 6 feet away behind a carpeted hallway, my father's attorney was dismantling the evening's central announcement with the quiet efficiency of a professional doing an unpleasant necessary thing. I ate my dessert. It was a chocolate torte with a raspberry coulis, and it was genuinely excellent, and I ate every bite because I had not eaten since noon, and because composure, real composure, is not a performance. It is a physiological state you maintain by keeping your blood sugar level and your breathing even and your hands still in your lap. My Aunt Celia asked me if I was enjoying myself. I told her the torte was wonderful. She agreed. We talked about whether chocolate or fruit desserts were more appropriate for anniversary dinners. It was the most normal 4 minutes of the entire evening. My father and Gerald were gone for 19 minutes this time, longer than the first hallway conversation. Long enough that my mother, who had been monitoring the door with the peripheral precision of a woman who has spent decades reading her husband's absences, excused herself quietly at the 14-minute mark. She did not come back for 7 minutes. When she returned, her lipstick was slightly less perfect than it had been, and she sat down and picked up her champagne with both hands, which is not how you pick up a champagne flute when everything is fine. Marcus watched her sit down. His fork moved more slowly through the remainder of his dessert. He was no longer making conversation. He was processing. I could see it in the particular stillness that had replaced his earlier expansiveness. The way a room gets quieter right before a storm, not because the storm is gentle, but because everything living in it has gone instinctively still. My father came back in at 9:21. This time he did not rearrange his face as successfully as before. This time the seams were visible to more than just me. His color was different. Not pale exactly, but drained of the particular vitality that had animated him during the toast, as though something that had been running warm inside him had been turned down. He did not go back to his seat. He went to Marcus. He put his hand on Marcus's shoulder and leaned down and said something close to his ear. I watched Marcus's fork stop moving. I watched him turn his head slowly and look at his father. And I watched the confidence, that wide, loud, 2 notches too far borrowed confidence, drain out of Marcus's face in real time the way color drains from something that has been cut from its source. He didn't speak. He just looked at our father with an expression I had never seen on Marcus before in 34 years of watching him occupy the warm center of this family's universe. He looked young, not golden, not chosen, just young. And suddenly, for the first time in his life, unsure of the ground. My father straightened. He looked across the table. He looked past my aunts and my cousins and my uncle with the bad knee. For the first time that evening, for possibly the first time in years, my father looked directly at me. Not past me, not through me, at me. And I looked back at him. I did not smile. I did not look away. I held his gaze the way you hold the gaze of someone who has just understood, fully and finally, that the furniture was watching the whole time. Then I reached into my bag one final time. I took out a single document, not the full packet, not the tabbed folder, just one page. A printed email chain. 14 months of correspondence between myself and Renata, summarized in a 2-page thread that ended with her attorney's formal letter sent that morning. I walked to my father. The room did not go silent because the room did not know what was happening. Conversations continued. Glasses were refilled. Someone laughed at something across the table. I crossed the room in my midnight blue dress with the document in my hand, and I stopped beside my father and I held it out to him, and I said, quietly enough that only he and Marcus could hear, I think you need to see how long this has been in motion. My father took the document. His hand was steady, I'll give him that. Whatever else he was not a man who shook in front of people. He looked at the first page. He looked at the dates. He looked at Renata's name appearing again and again across 14 months of correspondence. He looked at the final entry, her attorney's letter, timestamp 9:14 that morning, 7 hours before he had stood in this room and announced a transfer that could not legally proceed. He looked up from the document, and he said in a voice so low it was almost not a voice at all, "How long have you known?" Not a question. The punctuation was all wrong for a question. It was the statement of a man arriving late at an understanding. 3 years, I said. I found the clause 3 years ago. I found Renata 18 months ago. I filed the member objection tonight. He looked at me for a long time. Marcus was completely still beside him. The table around us continued its warm, oblivious life. Dessert and conversation, and someone refilling the champagne. And then my father said something I had not written into any version of how this evening would go. He said, "Your grandfather would have," and then he stopped. He didn't finish it. I don't know what he was going to say. I don't know if he was going to say my grandfather would have been proud, or horrified, or unsurprised, or something else entirely. He just stopped. And in that unfinished sentence I heard, for the first time, something that sounded almost like recognition. Not apology. Not the 34 years of grocery store cupcakes and wobbly chairs and third-person erasure being acknowledged and repaired in a sentence. Nothing heals like that. Nothing should. And I was not there for healing. I was there for precision. But recognition. The specific recognition of a man who has spent decades misidentifying a piece on the board and has only now, too late for it to help him, understood what he was looking at. I took the document back from him. I folded it. I put it in my bag. I said, "Enjoy the rest of the evening," and I went back to my seat by the kitchen, the wobbly one, the one with the card in the little gold holder that said my name in script, and I picked up my water glass, and for the first time since I was 7 years old standing in front of a pink frosted cake that was not for me, I felt the particular quiet of someone who has finished something. If you've been here from the beginning, subscribe right now, because the aftermath of this night is the part nobody talks about. The part after the room clears and the candles burn down and the real consequences begin to land. And that is where the most important part of this story actually lives. I left the Meridian at 9:47. Not dramatically, not with a speech or a backward glance, or any of the exit behaviors that would have felt satisfying in a film and hollow in a life. I said goodnight to my Aunt Celia. I told my cousin Priya I hoped the renovation went smoothly. I hugged my uncle with the bad knee and told him to listen to his physical therapist. I picked up my bag from under the wobbly chair and I walked out through the main dining room and past the maitre d' who had delivered the envelope and who gave me the small professional nod of a man who understood he had participated in something without being told what it was. The night air outside was cold and clean, and I stood on the pavement for 30 seconds and breathed it in before I called my car. In the car, I did not replay the evening. I did not rehearse what came next. I put my head back against the seat and I watched the city move past the window, and I let myself be still for the first time in 3 years. The stillness did not feel like victory. It felt like the moment after you have been holding something very heavy for a very long time and you have finally set it down and your arms do not know yet what to do without the weight. The consequences began arriving the next morning. Not loudly. Consequences of this kind do not arrive loudly. They arrive in the language of legal correspondence and missed calls and the particular silence of people who do not know what to say, because the story they had agreed on has been replaced by a different story with different authors. Gerald called my father at 8:15. I know this because Diane, who was now formally retained as my legal representative in the LLC matter, received a reciprocal call from Gerald's office at 8:40 asking to establish a timeline for mediation. Diane called me at 9. Her voice had the clean precision of a woman who respects outcomes achieved through proper process. They want to mediate, she said. Of course they do, I said. What's our position? Our position, I said, is that we are open to mediation provided that any proposed property transfer is formally suspended pending resolution of the consent claim, and that the LLC's unauthorized asset encumbrance is addressed in the same proceeding. There was a brief pause. That's going to be a long mediation, Diane said. I know, I said. I'm not in a hurry. The transfer was suspended within 72 hours. Not because my father chose to suspend it. My father, in those first 72 hours, was still in the processing stage. The stage where a man who has built his identity around being the one in control spends time cycling through the available responses, looking for one that restores the original order. He tried several. He called me once on the second day, and when I answered, he said he thought we should talk as a family before involving more attorneys. I said I agreed that family communication was valuable, and that I looked forward to seeing him at the mediation, where we would all be represented by counsel and everything said would be documented. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said my name, just my name, the way parents say a child's name when they are reaching for authority that has already left the room. I said, I'll see you there, Dad, and I ended the call. The transfer was suspended by legal necessity. The lender on Marcus's business loan was notified by the mediation process that the property listed in the personal guarantee was subject to an active consent dispute, which triggered a clause review on the loan itself. The lender's legal team found the same thing I had found. The guarantee was partially unsupported. The LLC encumbrance had been made without proper member authorization, and the loan's collateral structure had problems that required resolution before the next payment cycle. Marcus received a formal notice from the lender's attorneys on the fourth day after the dinner. I was not present when he read it. I did not need to be. The notice said what it said in the language that financial institutions use, which is precise and impersonal and does not adjust its tone based on how long someone has been told they were exceptional. His firm lost its remaining client 2 weeks later. The client was a business contact my father had introduced him to, and when word moved through that network, as word always moves through networks built on proximity to a single powerful person, quickly and without loyalty, the contact quietly redirected their work. Marcus's consulting firm was dissolved formally 6 weeks after the anniversary dinner. The website came down on a Tuesday. The Instagram account, the one with the sports car post about momentum and manifestation, went private on Wednesday. My father's network, the one he had spent decades cultivating, the one that had always closed around Marcus like a warm endorsement, did not close around Marcus this time. Networks built on one person's gravity do not transfer automatically. They require the gravity to remain intact. And my father's gravity was, in the weeks following the dinner, subject to its own complications. The valuation gap, the difference between his internal planning figures and the independent appraisal I had commissioned, had been surfaced in the mediation documentation. I had not filed a fraud complaint. I had not gone to any regulatory body. I had simply included the valuation in the formal record of the LLC dispute, alongside the independent appraiser's credentials and methodology, and allowed the existence of the gap to sit in the legal record the way a stone sits in a stream. Without commentary, without accusation, simply present and unmovable for anyone who chose to look. Several people chose to look. 2 of my father's long-standing business associates, men who had been guests at the anniversary dinner, men who had raised their glasses to legacy and capable hands, had their own attorneys review the mediation filings as a matter of standard due diligence. I do not know exactly what their attorneys told them. I know that within 8 weeks of the dinner, both men had quietly restructured their involvement with ventures my father had interest in. Business relationships that had existed for over a decade were renegotiated or allowed to lapse. Nobody made announcements. Nobody wrote anything inflammatory. It simply became, in the language of professional networks, known that Richard's affairs were complicated right now. And complicated is a word that causes people who have their own exposure to manage to create quiet distance. Renata and I spoke on video call 3 weeks after the dinner. She was sitting in her kitchen, which had yellow curtains and a window that looked out onto something green, and she looked like the photograph she had sent, except more tired and more real, and more like someone who had spent 20 years carrying something heavy and was only recently beginning to set it down. We talked for 2 hours. She told me the rest of the story about her leaving, the pressure that had been applied, the papers she had signed, the things she had been told would happen if she didn't. She told me she had spent years believing that the distance was something she deserved, that she had accepted her erasure from the family story so completely that she had almost stopped questioning it. And then she told me that my first email, the careful one, the rewritten 11 times one, had arrived on an evening when she was particularly tired of the weight of it, and that reading it she had felt something she described as the specific relief of being found by the right person at the right time. I did not cry on that call. I almost did. There is a version of this story where that is the moment that breaks through the composure, the yellow curtains and the woman who looks like my grandmother and the specific relief of being found. But I held it, not because I was performing strength, because the feeling was too real for performance and I wanted to be fully present for it, not observing it from behind the glass of emotional management. We are still in contact. We talk once a week. Her daughter, my cousin, is applying to a graduate program in a city 3 hours from where I live. We have plans to have dinner when she visits for her interview. Real dinner, unplanned seating, no name cards and gold holders. The mediation concluded 4 months after the anniversary dinner. The outcome was not what my father had planned and not what I had necessarily predicted in every detail, because legal proceedings are living things and they go where the evidence takes them, and the evidence, in this case, was extremely well documented. The property transfer was restructured. Renata's claim was formally recognized. The LLC dispute was resolved with a settlement that included a buyout of my membership stake at a figure assessed by an independent valuator. Not my father's internal figure, the independent one, the accurate one. I will not share the number. What I will tell you is that it was enough. Enough to be material. Enough to represent, in concrete financial terms, 34 years of being the one they counted out. Enough to fund the next stage of the life I had been building in the space they had decided I didn't occupy. Marcus moved back into my parents' house 6 months after the dinner. He is there now, as far as I know, occupying the room he grew up in the warm center of a family structure that is smaller now and less certain of itself than it was before that evening. My mother called me once in the months following. She did not apologize. She said she hoped I was well and that she wished things had gone differently. I said I was well. I did not say I wish things had gone differently, because I did not. I wish things had been different from the beginning. That is a different wish about a different set of choices made by different people long before that dinner, and it is not a wish I carry the way I used to. I carry it differently now, lightly. The way you carry something once you understand it is history and not destiny. I still have the sock drawer ribbon from my science fair. First place. I took it out recently and looked at it for the first time in years. It is faded, but intact, and it says what it said the day I won it, which is that I was the best in that room, that the work I did was seen by someone who was paying attention, and that the result was documented. That is all I ever wanted. To do the work. To have it documented. To have the result be what the result actually was, not what was convenient for someone else's narrative. I think about what it cost to get here, the office cleaning on Thursday nights, the instant noodles, the cap and gown and the takeout and the laugh that was genuine and not bitter, the 17-year-old with the notebook and the margins full of dates, and I do not regret a single Thursday. Here is the question I want to leave you with. And I mean it genuinely, because I think about it often and I do not have a clean answer. When the people who were supposed to choose you don't, when the roses go on someone else's cake and the seats by the kitchen are where they put you and the speeches say your name once in 19. Do you spend your life trying to make them see you? Or do you build something so undeniable that the question of their seeing becomes beside the point? I built the thing. I am still building it. And I would really like to know, what would you have done?